The woman at my door wasn't just desperate, she was terrified. Her hair clung in damp strands to her temples, and her fingers twitched as she clutched the frame, as if trying to anchor herself to reality.
My husband is inside, she said.
I glanced over my shoulder into my quiet apartment, feeling a ridiculous prickle of fear. You have the wrong address. It's just me.
No, she whispered, her breath hitching. He's inside. Please let me find him before you notice him.
That last part sent a deep chill through me. I slammed the door and locked it, but I could hear her muffled voice still pleading.
He stands still, she sobbed.
I was frozen. Then with a deep breath, I grabbed the crowbar from the linen closet and searched my place. It was indeed empty, but the air felt too heavy, as if it was pressing against my skin. Then I remembered the dumbwaiter shaft behind the kitchen door. It had been sealed years ago, after the previous owners died in a horrible accident. And later, when the house was bought by us, it was turned into a pass-through for old cables. But now I wasn't sure. Knife in hand, I pried it open. The panel groaned like a dying thing. My heart pounded as I bent down to grab my fallen knife. Geez, how creepy. Convinced that if I looked up too fast, something would be there like every other horror movie I've watched. But I saw nothing, just darkness. I was relieved. When I turned back toward the front door, I saw a crumpled envelope shoved under it. 3 words written in trembling ink. It was probably the lady who was there earlier. The note read,
Please listen carefully.
Then a whisper so close to the bottom of the door that it sounded like she was lying against it.
The first time he was standing behind my desk, just inches from me, in the hollow where my chair pushed in. The second time, I found him inside a glass display case, wedged between the shelves.
Her voice hitched.
He's getting better. He knows where your eyes land and where they don't.
Something shifted behind me. I spun, knife raised, but the apartment was still empty. Or maybe I just wasn't looking right. I snapped at her. Go away. The whispering stopped. I forced myself to watch TV, every light on, but my attention kept drifting to the window. Across the street, the park stretched out in quiet, except for a few kids playing at the far end, and then I saw her. The woman, now eerily composed, sat on a bench under a patch of deep shadow, the blue glow of an e-cigarette pulsing against her lips. She wasn't watching me, not directly. Her eyes hovered slightly off, like she was pretending not to look directly in my direction. I debated going outside to confront her. I was so mad at her because why would she out of nowhere show up at my doorstep being creepy? Then I turned and he was inside my kitchen. I didn't scream. My throat locked. He stood beside the fridge, his body bent at an inhuman angle, head tilted forward like a doll on a broken string. His arms were stiff at his sides, hands curled into claws, fingers frozen in some unfinished gesture. His face was smooth, pale. His lips glistened red, as if they'd been pressed against something wet. But his eyes were not on me. They were aimed just past my shoulder, so still and vacant that it made my skin crawl. Sir, I choked out, you need to leave this place now. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. I called 911, my voice barely above a whisper. The operator urged me to leave the house immediately like they always do. I had to pass by him to escape. Then, in an instant, he was gone like he was never even there. Not moved, not shifted, just simply gone. I stumbled out of my apartment, gasping, and ran. I had no plan, no phone, and nowhere to go. But a car door swung open beside me, and the woman inside waved me over.
I'll teach you to see them,
she said. And God help me, I got in.
Flora, by the way.
That's what she said to call her the same woman from earlier, and I know I was stupid to get in the car, but I got in. She drove me out of the city in silence, until streetlights faded into endless dirt lots and half-built structures. I didn't have a good feeling about it at all. She pulled into a construction site, headlights carving long, jagged shadows across skeletal walls. My instincts screamed, but her voice was steady.
Lie down,
she said, spreading a blanket on the raw earth.
We'll watch the stars.
Inside, I felt like screaming, like a teapot that's been on the stove way too long. Okay, calm down, Alina. You are overthinking, I told myself. But something in her eyes, something calm, exhausted, knowing, held me there. She whispered,
You're looking for him wrong. That's why you keep losing him.
We lay there, staring up at the sky. I wanted to run, but her voice was hypnotic.
You look for shooting stars, don't you?
She murmured.
Little bright things streaking across the sky. But you'll never see them that way.
I said nothing.
To see the men who stand still, you can't search for them. You have to let them settle into your vision naturally. They aren't objects in space, they become permanent.
Something in her voice made my skin prickle.
Just like the stars, she whispered. So many, waiting, right outside your perception.
Then suddenly I saw one, not a shooting star, but a man, standing between two unfinished walls, arms locked at his sides, body slightly tilted forward. Then another by the rusted bulldozer, half shadowed by the night. Then another and another. I sat up, heart hammering. I was scared.
They're everywhere.
Flora whispered.
They always have been.
My breath came sharp. What do they want? I asked. Flora's mouth opened, but she hesitated. Then, for the first time, I saw real fear in her face. She was staring past me. I turned, slow, my stomach coiling with dread. And there, pressed against the wall of her car, head bent at a sick angle, was her husband, still, watching, smiling, and even closer than before. My breath stilled. My body tensed, my muscles locking up like they weren't even mine anymore. Her husband hadn't moved at all, but he was closer. I blinked. He was even more closer. Not a single sound, no footsteps, no shift in the gravel, but he was inches from my face now. His mouth was parted slightly, like he was mid-sentence, like he had something to say but had been caught like a kid with his hand in a cookie jar just before he could speak. His lips were damp, his teeth, too even, too straight, gleamed under the cold light of the stars. Flora grabbed my wrist, her fingers iron tight.
Do not dare to look away.
I didn't. I couldn't move at all. I felt like my skull would crack if I did. A horrible idea gripped me then. If I turned my head even slightly, if I let my vision drift, he would be inside me. Inside my skull, inside my mind, filling up every single empty space. Flora's grip tight.
We need to go.
But he was still there. I knew that if I broke eye contact, I wouldn't get another chance to see him coming.
He won't stop.
Flora whispered.
They never do.
The man's fingers twitched. The motion sent a ripple through his stillness, like a statue on the verge of cracking. I felt like I was going to throw up. Flora yanked me up so fast, my legs buckled. We staggered back, crunching over gravel, never breaking our gaze. The second we hit the car, she shoved me inside and I slammed the door shut, and there he was, right at the window. Face pressed against the glass, fog blooming across it. The bones in his neck stretched too long, his limbs too loose, like his joints didn't hold together the same way mine did. I didn't even hear Flora turn the key, or hear the engine start. I only noticed we were moving when he didn't. We pulled away, the tires spitting dirt. His eyes followed us, but his body never flinched. Even as we drove faster, even as we rounded the bend, I saw him still standing there. Then the headlights flickered, and he was running. Not moving, not leaning forward, just there, closer, then again, closer. I turned to Flora, my voice strangled. He's running, I said, panicking. Flora's knuckles were white on the wheel.
They don't run.
But he was. I turned back. He was farther away now, the distance stretching, but I still felt him near. And then, right before we lost sight of him, he smiled. A real smile, not frozen, not caught mid-expression. He was learning. He was getting faster. And he knew we knew. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Flora. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Her gaze was distant, stuck somewhere I couldn't reach. I was still trying to catch my breath. My body ached in places I hadn't even realized I'd tensed. And I could still see him, still feel him. Even now, sitting in the dim glow of the kitchen light, I swore if I glanced at the window, I'd see his reflection. Not outside, but inside, watching, learning. I swallowed, my throat dry. Who was he? Flora exhaled slowly, like she'd been waiting for the question. But when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper.
He wasn't always like this.
I waited. She didn't look at me when she continued.
His name was Adrian.
A pause.
And he was my husband.
A chill ran down my spine. She closed her eyes.
Years ago, Adrian worked night shifts at a restaurant. I barely saw him, but one morning he came home different.
The air in the room seemed to grow heavy. She said.
Didn't say a word, just stared at me.
I thought of the way he'd stood outside the car, the stillness, the unnatural wrongness. Flora rubbed her arms as if remembering the cold.
At first I thought he was tired, but then I noticed he didn't blink. He didn't even sway on his feet, just stood there.
She finally looked at me.
And then I saw his mouth.
The memory seemed to shake her.
It wasn't open. It wasn't closed. It was just stuck, frozen, like he'd been caught mid-movement.
I felt sick.
That night, I woke up to him standing over the bed.
She inhaled sharply.
He was even closer than before.
I thought of the way he'd appeared at my window. Nearer. What happened to him? I asked. Flora's fingers dug into her arms.
I don't know.
A pause.
And I don't think he does either.
I shivered. What do you mean? Her lips parted, hesitant, as if the words themselves felt wrong.
Adrian wasn't the same after that night. He changed, stopped speaking, stopped moving the way he used to.
She swallowed.
And one day, he was just gone.
My heart pounded.
I tried to forget, tried to move on.
Her voice grew hoarse.
But sometimes at night I'd feel it, the weight of something watching.
A lump formed in my throat. How long has he been following you? She exhaled, a hollow sound.
Since the day he disappeared.
The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, barely above a whisper, she said,
He's getting closer.
A chill ran through me, and somewhere, just outside the window, I swore I heard footsteps. Soft, careful, close. My breath hitched, my body frozen in place. Flora didn't move either. Her fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles turning white. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared. And then suddenly the sound stopped. But the weight of his presence, it didn't. Flora exhaled shakily. She placed the mug down with slow, deliberate care, as if any sudden movement would shatter the fragile silence. She turned to me.
I think he's waiting.
She whispered. For what? My voice barely made it past my throat. She stared at the window for a long time before answering.
For me.
The words stung, like they meant more than I understood. I watched her, searching her face, but she wouldn't look at me. Instead, she traced her fingers along the rim of the mug, lost in a memory I wasn't part of, a memory of him. I hadn't known Flora for years. We just met accidentally, but I've grown to care in just few hours. I can only imagine the pain she must be going through of never being able to erase the ghost of someone she had already given her heart to. She didn't need to say it out loud. I could see it plastered on her face. Because some things don't die. Not love, not regret. Not the people who leave us behind. They never truly let us go. I swallowed the ache in my chest. Flora, she met my gaze. There was something in her eyes. Something soft, something breaking. She reached for my hand, and I held hers tightly, understanding what she's going through is terrifying.
I'm scared.
She admitted. I squeezed her hand. I won't let him take you. She smiled then, a sad, quiet smile, like she knew something I didn't, like she had already made a choice. Before I could say anything, the footsteps started again. Closer, nearer, I turned to look at the window and saw him. Not outside, but inside, standing in the doorway. And Flora, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was just waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady, aching rhythm of dread. But Flora, she didn't even flinch. She didn't back away. She just stood there, breath shallow, hands trembling at her sides. And he stood in the doorway. The dim light from the kitchen barely reached him, but I could see enough. His figure was the same. The height, the shape, the way his shoulders hunched, like the weight of something unbearable pressed down on them. Like a man carrying too much sorrow. But his face wasn't right. It was blurred, shifting like smoke in the dark. His eyes, as if they weren't even eyes, they were sunken pits of shadow. There was no light in them, no soul, just an endless, hollow pull. And yet Flora stepped closer. I grabbed her wrist. Flora, no. Her fingers curled over mine, gentle, almost apologetic.
I have to.
She whispered. My throat tightened. Why? Put yourself in danger, Flora. She finally looked at me, and I saw it then. The guilt. The kind of guilt that sinks deep into your bones, that never stops gnawing, never lets you rest.
I left him,
She said.
I promised I wouldn't, but I did.
A lump formed in my throat. I had always known. Flora had a past she never spoke about, A love she never mourned the way people do when it's clean, when it's fair, when it makes sense. Love like hers, it just sat there, unspoken. A wound no one could touch. "He's not real," I said, my voice barely holding steady.
He was. Her voice cracked. And I told him I'd stay. I told him I wouldn't let go.
I shook my head. "He's gone, Flora." But she just smiled. A small sad thing. Then she let go of my hand and walked toward him. My whole body screamed to pull her back, to stop her to do anything. But something kept me still. Not fear, but understanding. Some people don't move on. Some people leave but never let go. And some people are left behind. Flora had been leaving pieces of herself in the past for years, and now she was finally going back for them. The figure in the doorway reached for her. Long fingers, almost too thin, too stretched like time itself had warped them. She took his hand. A breath left my chest. The air shifted. The shadows around him twisted, curling inward like they were pulling back, pulling in, pulling away. And then they were gone, just like that. The house was silent, the air still. The only thing left was the cold mug on the counter. And me, alone. I stayed there for a long time, listening, hoping, hurting. But she didn't come back. She was never going to. Flora had always belonged to the past, and tonight she finally went home.